Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session where we're going to cover the chapter two of your textbook, but with a twist. So, chapter two of your textbook is focusing on listening and ethics. And when they're focusing on ethics, they're focusing on your ethic as a listener. But here, I'm going to cover ethics for you as a speaker. And the reason why I am always combining this chapter about ethics with persuasive speech that we have covered last week is because whenever you're trying to persuade people to agree with your opinion or with your take on something, I want you to consider the ethics behind it. All right, so let's start with the first slide. So, in public speaking, especially so in persuasive speech, ethics, which here I define as rules and values that a group defines to guide conduct and distinguish between right and wrong, can come into play during every stage of the process. And we're going to talk about this more. So, before we talk about how ethics comes into every stage of this speech, let's talk about codes of ethics first. So, for persuasive speech, I want you to understand that there are three types of codes of ethics. One is what we call as absolute ethics, the belief that people should exhibit the same behavior in all situations. And we understand that absolute ethics is really almost impossible for you to apply. For instance, if you believe in this idea that thou shalt not kill, for instance, the truth is when you are put in a position where you have to protect yourself, where you have to protect your loved ones, I'm pretty sure that this belief that thou shall not kill maybe is not going to be your first priority anymore, and maybe you will try to kill others in order to save yourself. Okay, this is such a morbid example, but it is something that we can see when, for instance, you're joining military and you have to be deployed to defend your countries, and you understand that this idea of thou shalt not kill will not become your first principle anymore. And this also, can be applicable to other principles as well, such as, for instance, you say that um, I believe that everyone should be truthful all the time. Then we understand that it's not going to be beneficial for you to have this kind of belief. And the truth is, when you think about being truthful all the time, people tend to be following the second types of codes of ethics, which is situational ethics, which is the belief that correct behavior can vary depending on the situation at hand. So, for instance, you receive sweater for Christmas presents, and it's ugly. Ugh. But when your aunt, for instance, asks you, "Hey, do you find this sweater uh, pretty?" Then you would say, "Yeah, yeah, it's very pretty. Thank you so much." So, in that sense, even when you believe that you have to be truthful, you don't actually tell the truth because you want to protect the other person's feeling. And that goes in all kind of relationships, I believe. If you, for instance, have a girlfriend and you want to give your girlfriend a gift, then you are trying to give her the best gift that you could, and if she says that she doesn't like it, that's going to crush your feeling. Or if your partner says, "Hey, do I look good in this dress, or do I look good in this sweater?" Then even when they don't look really that good, you try to not hurt their feelings. And so even when you believe that being truthful is very important, you may in that particular moment choose to um, basically believe in the situational ethics, which is the correct behavior can vary depending on the situation at hand. And then, of course, you have the third one, which is the culturally relative ethics. It shows that ethics can vary across societies. And when it comes to an example of this, for instance, here in the United States, people believe that we go into marriage because we fall in love with our partner. So this idea of marriage because of love is very important in this culture. But in other cultures, this idea of marriage may not be because of love. This idea of marriage because both of your parents, for instance, believe that you are a good match for one another, or the idea that because in your belief system, it's good for you to actually get married before you date or get to know each other. So this idea of culturally relative ethics is also very common. And I know that marriage is one example, and I'm going to ask at the end of this presentation for you to think of an example for each of them. So what is your example for an absolute ethics? What is your an example for situational ethic? And what is your example for culturally relative ethics? I'm going to ask that in the discussion forum that I'm going to set up, and each one of you will be able to answer the questions and actually write comments on each other's answers so that we can have quote unquote lively discussion online. Okay, now let's move on to the other type of speech, which is legal speech versus ethical speech. So here, I want you to understand, when we're talking about ethical speech, we follow the guidelines for telling the truth and avoid misleading an audience because such actions are ethical and the right thing to do. So we believe that as much as we can, we try to provide audience with balanced views, and you're not trying to manipulate them into thinking one way just because you believe that's going to be beneficial for you. Yeah. So the goal of persuasive speech, even when we understand you want to weaken commitment, strengthen commitment, or promote actions, you also need to make sure that you are telling the truth and you avoid misleading your audience. And then the next one is what we call as legal speech, which use law as your boundary for what you may say and how you say it. So based on this approach, your decision making has nothing to do with ethics. It is only driven by what is technically within the legal rules. And you see this all the time, where people would find loopholes in the law and they will be able to say that in their defense, it's not illegal. So when you say it's not illegal, doesn't mean that it is truthful or it is ethically correct. So, or morally correct. So I want you to, whenever you can, for your persuasive speech, to make sure that your goal is to deliver an ethical speech and not a legal speech. And then the next thing that I would like to cover is this idea about First Amendment. So I know that First Amendment in the United States protects you for this for this idea of freedom of speech. But even though it allows for a vast range of legally protected statements, there are relatively few exceptions, and those are slander, fighting words, and obscenity. So I want you to take a look at this PowerPoint slide and understand what is slander, what is fighting word, and what is obscenity. And when you can, think about some examples for each one of them. Another thing that is not protected by the freedom of speech is this idea of hate speech. So this is any offensive communication, verbal or non-verbal, that is directed against people's racial, ethnic, religious, gender, or other characteristics. So this kind of speech is never acceptable. So you cannot basically attack other people's based on all of these characteristics. And I really do want you, when you're thinking about your own project, that you're not going to try to incorporate any hate speech in your persuasive speech just because you're trying to persuade your audience, because it's not going to fly in this course, and you are not allowed, legally you're not allowed to actually produce a hate speech. So when you're trying to communicate truthfully, what is it that you have to do? For instance, you definitely obviously have to try to strive to provide as truthful of information as possible, and you are not going to lie about the information that you provide, and you're not going to deliver any half truths. You're not going to try to actually include any false inference, which is dropping hints designed to make their audience believe something that isn't true. Yeah. Or you're not going to take evidence out of context, yeah, sharing a source's data or statements without explaining how they relate to the original situation, because this is a form of false inference. And you are not going to practice omission, which is misleading the audience not by what they say, but by what they leave unsaid, because this is also another form of false inference. And then when you're trying to deliver an ethical speech, you're going to avoid plagiarism. So plagiarism is the passing off of another person's information as one's own. And it is unethical in a speech as it is elsewhere. Yeah. We talk about plagiarism when writing paper. We talk also about plagiarism when delivering a speech. You need to always make sure that you cite your sources orally. Yeah. So one exception to sources needing citation is the use of common knowledge, information that is likely to be known by many people. For instance, we know that the capital city of Colorado is Denver. So we don't have to cite any information about that because that's pretty much a common knowledge that everyone knows. So when we're citing quotation, paraphrases, and summaries, I want you to make sure that you understand. When you are delivering a speech and you are providing information to your audience, those information are usually, you have it because you read journal articles, or you read magazines, or you read articles on websites. Then make sure that you know what is it that you're doing when you are giving that information. Are you using direct quotations, which are verbatim or word for word presentations of statements made by someone else? It's a direct quote and should always be acknowledged in a speech. Yeah, as for instance stated in the Journal of Health, published in 2013 or something like that. A paraphrase is a restatement of someone else's ideas, opinions, or theories in the speaker's own words. So when you paraphrase, you state the same idea with your own words. Yeah, because paraphrases alter the form but not the substance of another person's idea, you must also acknowledge the original source. And then you also have a summary, which is basically a brief overview of someone else's ideas, opinions, or theories. And that's it for our mini lectures on ethics. And two things that I would like you to do after you finish watching or listening to this presentation. One is for you to go to your discussion forum, and two is for you to take a quiz. Excuse me. So I have a quiz 3 that I've already uploaded on your D2L, and as usual, the quiz has two forms or two parts. Part 1 is true or false and multiple choice, and part 2 is long answer. And then after that, you also have a discussion forum. So please go there and take the quiz and answer the discussion questions that I set up in the discussion section. Thank you, everyone.